Section 70 of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The World's Story, Volume 9, England, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 70. The Coming of Philip II, 1554, by William H. Prescott. On the 19th of July, the fleets came to anchor in the port of Southampton. A number of barges were soon seen pushing off from the shore, one of which, protected by a rich awning and superbly lined with cloth of gold, was manned by sailors whose dress of white and green intimated the royal livery. It was the Queen's barge, intended for Philip, while the other boats, all gaily ornamented, received his nobles and their retinues. The Editor. The Spanish prince was welcomed, on landing, by a goodly company of English lords assembled to pay him their allegiance. The Earl of Arundel presented him, in the Queen's name, with the splendid insignia of the Order of the Garter. Philip's dress, as usual, was of plain black velvet, with a barret cap, ornamented after the fashion of the time with gold chains. By Mary's orders, a spirited Andalusian jennet had been provided for him, which the prince instantly mounted. He was a good rider, and pleased the people by his courteous bearing and the graceful manner in which he managed his horse. The royal procession then moved forward to the ancient church of the Holy Rood, where Mass was said, and thanks were offered up for their prosperous voyage. Philip, after this, repaired to the quarters assigned to him during his stay in the town. They were sumptuously fitted up, and the walls of the principal apartment hung with arras, commemorating the doings of that royal polemic, Henry VIII. Among other inscriptions in honor of him might be seen one proclaiming him head of the church and defender of the faith, words which, as they were probably in Latin, could not have been lost on the Spaniards. The news on Philip's landing was received in London with every demonstration of joy. Guns were fired, bells were rung, processions were made to the churches, bonfires were lighted in all the principal streets, tables were spread in the squares, laden with good cheer, and wine and ale flowed freely as water for all comers. In short, the city gave itself up to a general jubilee, as if it were celebrating some victorious monarch returned to his dominions, and not the man whose name had lately been the object of such general execration. Mary gave instant orders that the nobles of her court should hold themselves in readiness to accompany her to Winchester, where she was to receive the prince, and on the 21st of July she made her entry, in great state, into that capital, and established her residence at the episcopal palace. During the few days that Philip stayed at Southampton, he rode constantly abroad, and showed himself frequently to the people. The information he had received, before his voyage, of the state of public feeling, had suggested to him some natural apprehensions for his safety. He seems to have resolved, from the first, therefore, to adopt such a condescending, and indeed affable demeanour, as would disarm the jealousy of the English, and if possible conciliate their goodwill. In this he appears to have been very successful, although some of the more haughty of the aristocracy did take exception at his neglecting to raise his cap to them. That he should have imposed the degree of restraint which he seems to have done on the indulgence of his natural disposition is good proof of the strength of his apprehensions. The favour which Philip showed the English gave umbrage to his own nobles. They were still more disgusted by the rigid interpretation of one of the marriage articles, by which some hundreds of their attendants were prohibited, as foreigners, from landing, or after landing were compelled to re-embark and return to Spain. Whenever Philip went abroad, he was accompanied by Englishmen. He was served by Englishmen at his meals. He breakfasted and dined in public, a thing but little to his taste. He drank health after the manner of the English, and encouraged his Spanish followers to imitate his example, as he quaffed the strong ale of the country. On the 23rd of the month, the Earl of Pembroke arrived, with a brilliant company of 200 mounted gentlemen, to escort the prince to Winchester. He was attended, moreover, by a body of English archers, whose tunics of yellow cloth, striped with bars of red velvet, displayed the gaudy coloured livery of the House of Aragon. The day was unpropitious. The rain fell heavily, in such torrents as might have cooled the enthusiasm of a more ardent lover than Philip. But he was too gallant a cavalier to be daunted by the elements. The distance, not great in itself, was to be travelled on horseback, the usual mode of conveyance at that time, when roads were scarcely practicable for carriages. Philip and his retinue had not proceeded far when they were encountered by a cavalier riding at full speed, and bringing with him a ring which Mary had sent her lover, with the request that he would not expose himself to the weather, but postpone his departure to the following day. The prince, not understanding the messenger, who spoke in English, and suspecting that it was intended by Mary to warn him of some danger in his path, instantly drew up by the roadside, and took counsel with Alva and Egmont as to what was to be done. One of the courtiers, who perceived his embarrassment, rode up and acquainted the prince with the real purport of the message. Relieved of his alarm, Philip no longer hesitated, but with his red felt cloak wrapped closely about him, and a broad beaver slouched over his eyes, manfully pushed forward, in spite of the tempest. As he advanced, his retinue received continual accessions from the neighbouring gentry and yeomanry, until it amounted to some thousands before he reached Winchester. It was late in the afternoon when the cavalcade, soiled with travel and thoroughly drenched with rain, arrived before the gates of the city. The mayor and aldermen, dressed in their robes of scarlet, came to welcome the prince, and presenting the keys of the city, conducted him to his quarters. That evening Philip had his first interview with Mary. It was private, and he was taken to her residence by the Chancellor, Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester. The royal pair passed an hour or more together, and as Mary spoke the Castilian fluently, the interview must have been spared much of the embarrassment that would otherwise have attended it. On the following day the parties met in public. Philip was attended by the principal persons of his suite, of both sexes, and as the procession, making a goodly show, passed through the streets on foot, the minstrelsy played before them till they reached the royal residence. The reception room was the great hall of the palace. Mary, stepping forward to receive her betrothed, saluted him with a loving kiss before all the company. She then conducted him to a sort of throne, where she took her seat by his side under a stately canopy. They remained there for an hour or more, conversing together, while the courtiers had leisure to become acquainted with one another, and to find ample food, doubtless for future criticism, in the peculiarities of national costume and manners. Notwithstanding the Spanish blood in Mary's veins, the higher circles of Spain and England had personally almost as little intercourse with one another at that period as England and Japan have at present. Footnote: this was written in 1855. End footnote. The ensuing day, the festival of St. James, the patron saint of Spain, was the one appointed for the marriage. Philip exchanged his usual simple dress for the bridal vestments provided for him by his mistress. They were of spotless white, as the reporter is careful to inform us, satin and cloth of gold, thickly powdered with pearls and precious stones. Round his neck he wore the superb collar of the Golden Fleece, the famous Burgundian order, while the brilliant ribbon below his knee served as the badge of the no less illustrious Order of the Garter. He went on foot to the cathedral, attended by all his nobles, vying with one another in the ostentatious splendour of their retinues. Half an hour elapsed before Philip was joined by the Queen at the entrance of the cathedral. Mary was surrounded by the lords and ladies of her court. Her dress, of white satin and cloth of gold, like his own, was studded and fringed with diamonds of inestimable price, some of them, doubtless, the gift of Philip, which he had sent to her by the hands of the Prince of Eboli soon after his landing. Her bright red slippers and her mantle of black velvet formed a contrast to the rest of her apparel, and for a bridal costume would hardly suit the taste of the present day. The royal party then moved up the nave of the cathedral and were received in the choir by the Bishop of Winchester, supported by the great prelates of the English Church. The greatest of all, Cranmer, the primate of all England, was absent, in disgrace and a prisoner. Philip and Mary took their seats under a royal canopy, with an altar between them. The Queen was surrounded by the ladies of the court, whose beauty, says an Italian writer, acquired additional lustre by contrast with the shadowy complexions of the south. The aisles and spacious galleries were crowded with spectators of every degree, drawn together from the most distant quarters to witness the ceremony. The silence was broken by Figueroa, one of the imperial council, who read aloud an instrument of the Emperor Charles V. It stated that this marriage had been of his own seeking, and he was desirous that his beloved son should enter into it in a manner suitable to his own expectations and the dignity of his illustrious consort. He therefore resigned to him his entire right and sovereignty over the kingdom of Naples and the duchy of Milan. The rank of the parties would thus be equal, and Mary, instead of giving her hand to a subject, would wed a sovereign like herself. Some embarrassment occurred as to the person who should give the Queen away, a part of the ceremony not provided for. After a brief conference it was removed by the Marquis of Winchester and the Earls of Pembroke and Derby, who took it on themselves to give her away in the name of the whole realm, at which the multitude raised a shout that made the old walls of the cathedral ring again. The marriage service was then concluded by the Bishop of Winchester. Philip and Mary resumed their seats, and Mass was performed, when the bridegroom, rising, gave his consort the kiss of peace, according to the custom of the time. The whole ceremony occupied nearly 4 hours. At the close of it, Philip, taking Mary by the hand, led her from the church. The royal couple were followed by the long train of prelates and nobles, and were preceded by the Earls of Pembroke and Derby, each bearing aloft a naked sword, the symbol of sovereignty. The effect of the spectacle was heightened by the various costumes of the two nations, the richly tinted and picturesque dresses of the Spaniards, and the solid magnificence of the English and Flemings, mingling together in gay confusion. The glittering procession moved slowly on, to the blithe sounds of festal music, while the air was rent with the loyal acclamations of the populace, delighted as usual with the splendor of the pageant. In the great hall of the episcopal palace, a sumptuous banquet was prepared for the whole company. At one end of the apartment was a dais, on which, under a superb canopy, a table was set for the king and queen, and the third seat was added for Bishop Gardiner, the only one of the great lords who was admitted to the distinction of dining with royalty. Below the dais, the tables were set on either side, through the whole length of the hall, for the English and Spanish nobles, all arranged, a perilous point of etiquette, with due regard to their relative rank. The royal table was covered with dishes of gold. A spacious buffet, rising to the height of 8 stages, or shelves, and filled with a profusion of gold and silver vessels, somewhat ostentatiously displayed the magnificence of the prelate or of his sovereign. Yet this ostentation was rather Spanish than English, and was one of the forms in which the Castilian grandee loved to display his opulence. At the bottom of the hall was an orchestra occupied by a band of excellent performers, who enlivened the repast by their music. But the most interesting part of the show was that of the Winchester boys, some of whom were permitted to enter the presence and recite in Latin their epithalamiums in honor of the royal nuptials, for which they received a handsome guerdon from the Queen. After the banquet came the ball, at which, if we are to take an old English authority, the Spaniards were greatly out of countenance when they saw the English so far excel them. This seems somewhat strange, considering that dancing is, and always has been, the national pastime of Spain. Dancing is to the Spaniard what music is to the Italian, the very condition of his social existence. It did not continue late on the present occasion, and at the temperate hour of 9 the bridal festivities closed for the evening. End of section 70. Section 71 of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The World's Story, Volume 9, England, edited by Eva March Tappan, Section 71. England's Reconciliation with Rome, 1554, by James Anthony Froude. When Mary came to the throne, her strongest desire was to bring her country back to the Church of Rome. St. Andrew's Day was the time appointed for the formal reconciliation. The Editor. And now St. Andrew's Day was come, a day, as was then hoped, which would be remembered with awe and gratitude through all ages of English history. Being the festival of the institution of the Order of the Golden Fleece, High Mass was sung in the morning in Westminster Abbey. Philip, Alva, and Roy Gomez attended in their robes, with 600 Spanish cavaliers. The Knights of the Garter were present in gorgeous costume, and nave and transept were thronged with the blended chivalry of England and Castile. It was 2 o'clock before the service was concluded. Philip returned to the palace to dinner, and the brief November afternoon was drawing in when the Parliament reassembled at the palace. At the upper end of the great hall a square platform had now been raised, several steps above the floor, on which 3 chairs were placed as before, 2 under a canopy of cloth of gold, for the king and queen, a third on the right, removed a little distance from them, for the legate. Below the platform, benches were placed longitudinally towards either wall. The bishops sat on the side of the legate, the lay peers opposite them on the left. The commons sat on rows of cross benches in front, and beyond them were the miscellaneous crowd of spectators, sitting or standing as they could find room. The cardinal who had passed the morning at Lambeth was conducted across the water in a state barge by Lord Arundel and 6 other peers. The king received him at the gate, and leaving his suite in the care of the Duke of Alva, who was instructed to find them places, he accompanied Philip into the room adjoining the hall, where Mary, whose situation was supposed to prevent her from unnecessary exertion, was waiting for them. The royal procession was formed. Arundel and the lords passed in to their places. The king and queen, with Paul in his legate's robes, ascended the steps of the platform and took their seats. When the stir which had been caused by their entrance was over, Gardiner mounted a tribune, and in the now fast waning light he bowed to the king and queen, and declared the resolution at which the houses had arrived. Then turning to the lords and commons he asked if they continued in the same mind. 400 voices answered, "We do." "Will you, then," he said, "that I proceed in your names to supplicate for our absolution, that we may be received again into the body of the Holy Catholic Church, under the Pope, the supreme head thereof?" Again the voices ascended. The Chancellor drew a scroll from under his robe, ascended the platform, and presented it unfolded on his knee to the Queen. The Queen looked through it, gave it to Philip, who looked through it also, and returned it. The Chancellor then read aloud the writing of the scroll. This expressed, in behalf of all England, repentance for the separation from the Roman Church, and prayed for absolution. Having completed the reading, the Chancellor again presented the petition. The King and Queen went through the forms of intercession, and the Secretary read aloud, first, the Legate's original commission, and next, the all-important extended form of it. Paul's share of the ceremony was now to begin. He first spoke a few words from his seat. Much indeed, he said, the English nation had to thank the Almighty for recalling them to his fold. Once again, God has given a token of his special favor to the realm, for as this nation, in the time of the primitive church, was the first to be called out of the darkness of heathenism, so now they were the first to whom God had given grace to repent of their schism, and if their repentance was sincere, how would the angels, who rejoice at the conversion of a single sinner, triumph at the recovery of a great and noble people? He moved to rise. Mary and Philip, seeing that the crisis was approaching, fell on their knees, and the assembly dropped at their example, while, in dead silence, across the dimly lighted hall came the low, awful words of the absolution. Our Lord Jesus Christ, which with his most precious blood has redeemed and washed us from all our sins and iniquities, that he might purchase unto himself a glorious spouse, without spot or wrinkle, whom the Father has appointed head over all his church, he by his mercy absolves you, and we, by apostolic authority given unto us by the most holy Lord Pope Julius III, his vice-regent on earth, do absolve and deliver you, and every of you, with this whole realm and the dominions thereof, from all heresy and schism, and from all and every judgment, censure, and pain for that cause incurred. And we do restore you again into the unity of our Mother the Holy Church, in the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amidst the hushed breathing every tone was audible, and at the pauses were heard the smothered sobs of the Queen. Amen, Amen, rose in answer from many voices. Some were really affected, some were caught for the moment with the contagion which it was hard to resist, some threw themselves weeping in each other's arms. King, Queen, and Parliament, rising from their knees, went immediately, the legate leading, into the chapel of the palace, where the choir, with the rolling organ, sang Te Deum, and Paul closed the scene with a benediction from the altar. End of section 71.
Section 72 of England. Read for LibriVox.org by alanmapstone. Cranmer at the Traitors Gate by Frederick Goodall. English artist 1822 to 1904. Painting, page 500. When Cardinal Wolsey failed to secure a divorce for Henry VIII from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, mother of Queen Mary, one of his chaplains, Thomas Cranmer, was of great assistance to his scheme, and as a reward was made Archbishop of Canterbury. Moreover, when Henry VIII made his will, he appointed Cranmer one of the regents who should rule until Edward VI came of age. Cranmer was a Protestant, and agreed to placing Lady Jane Grey upon the throne. For these reasons Mary bore no good will toward him. He was soon sent to the Tower of London, and is shown in the illustration entering by way of what was known as the Traitors Gate. No man could hold the positions which he held without making enemies, and now in his downfall they were ready to seek their revenge. He was tried first as a traitor, then as a heretic. He was declared guilty on both charges and was burned at the stake in front of Balliol College, Oxford, in the year 1556. End of section 72. This recording is in the public domain. Section 73 of England. Read for LibriVox.org by alanmapstone. England, Part 11. In the days of Queen Elizabeth. Historical note. The reign of Queen Elizabeth, 1558 to 1603, was a period of great glory. The discoveries of her bold sea captains, Drake, Frobisher and others, widened the boundaries of the world, commerce flourished, and the East India Company and other great trading corporations sprang into existence, and the wealth of England grew apace. In 1568, Mary, Queen of Scots, fled to England, but was imprisoned by order of Elizabeth. During her long confinement, several conspiracies were devised by the Catholics to set her on the throne in place of Elizabeth. In one of these she was implicated, and after some hesitation, Elizabeth signed a warrant for her execution. To avenge her death and restore Catholicism, which had been superseded in England by Protestantism on the accession of Elizabeth, Philip II of Spain prepared to invade England. English troops had aided the Netherlanders in their revolt against Spanish rule. English freebooters had looted the Spanish treasure ships returning from the New World, and to make the punishment for all these offences swift and sure, a fleet was prepared for the invasion, so powerful that it was christened the Invincible Armada. But the confidence of Spain was short-lived. The Armada was defeated by the English fleet. The work of destruction begun by Drake, Howard and Hawkins was completed by the storm-swept Atlantic. Only 1/3 of the mighty Armada returned to tell Philip of the disaster that marks the beginning of the downfall of Spanish supremacy in Europe. The Elizabethan period is called the Golden Age of English literature. The old mystery plays continued far into Elizabeth's reign, but the drama was fast coming to its own. High among the poets and dramatists are Spenser, Johnson and Marlowe, while above them all towers the figure of Shakespeare, the crowning glory of the Elizabethan age. End of section 73. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 74 of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. The World's Story, Volume 9, England. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 74. The Great Queen as a Little Child, 1533 through 1539, by Agnes Strickland. Queen Elizabeth first saw the light at Greenwich Palace, the favourite abode of her royal parents, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Her birth is thus quaintly but prettily recorded by the contemporary historian Hall. On the 7th day of September, being Sunday, between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the Queen was delivered of a fair lady, on which day the Duke of Norfolk came home to the christening. The apartment in which she was born was hung with tapestry representing the history of holy virgins, and was from that circumstance called the Chamber of the Virgins. When the Queen, her mother, who had eagerly anticipated a son, was told that she had given birth to a daughter, she endeavoured with ready tact to attach adventitious importance to her infant, by saying to the ladies in attendance, They may now, with reason, call this room the Chamber of Virgins, for a virgin is now born in it on the vigil of that auspicious day on which the Church commemorates the Nativity of the Virgin Mary. Heywood, though a zealous eulogist of the Protestant principles of Elizabeth, intimates that she was under the especial patronage of the Blessed Virgin from the hour of her birth, and for that cause devoted to a maiden life. The Lady Elizabeth, says he, was born on the eve of the Virgin's nativity, and died on the eve of the Virgin's annunciation. Even that she is now in heaven with all those blessed virgins that had oil in their lamps. Notwithstanding the bitter disappointment felt by King Henry at the sex of the infant, a solemn Te Deum was sung in honor of her birth, and the preparations for her christening were made with no less magnificence than if his hopes had been gratified by the birth of a male heir to the crown. The solemnization of that sacred rite was appointed to take place on Wednesday, 10th of September, the 4th day after the birth of the infant princess. On that day the Lord Mayor, with the aldermen and council of the City of London, dined together at 1 o'clock, and then, in obedience to their summons, took boat in their chains and robes, and rode to Greenwich, where many lords, knights, and gentlemen were assembled to witness the royal ceremonial. All the walls between Greenwich Palace and the convent of the Greyfriars were hung with arras and the way strewn with green rushes. The church was likewise hung with arras. Gentlemen with aprons and towels about their necks guarded the font, which stood in the middle of the church. It was of silver, and raised to the height of 3 steps, and over it was a square canopy of crimson satin fringed with gold. About it a space railed in, covered with red say. Between the choir and chancel a closet with a fire had been prepared, lest the infant should take cold in being disrobed for the font. When all these things were ready, the child was brought into the hall of the palace, and the procession set out to the neighbouring church of the Greyfriars, of which building no vestige now remains at Greenwich. The procession began with the lowest rank. The citizens 2 and 2 led the way. Then gentlemen, esquires, and chaplains, a gradation of precedence, rather decidedly marked, of the first 3 ranks, whose distinction is by no means definite in the present times. After them the aldermen, and the Lord Mayor himself, then the Privy Council in robes, then the peers and prelates, followed by the Earl of Essex, who bore the gilt-covered basins, then the Marquis of Exeter, with the taper of virgin wax, next the Marquis of Dorset bearing the salt, and the Lady Mary of Norfolk, the betrothed of the young Duke of Richmond, carrying the chrism, which was very rich with pearls and gems. Lastly came the royal infant, in the arms of her great-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, under a stately canopy which was supported by the uncle of the babe, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, the Lords William and Thomas Howard, the maternal kindred of the mother, and Lord Hussey, a newly made lord of the Boleyn blood. The babe was wrapped in a mantle of purple velvet, with a train of regal length, furred with ermine, which was duly supported by the Countess of Kent, assisted by the Earl of Wiltshire, the grandfather of the little princess, and the Earl of Derby. On the right of the infant marched its great-uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, with his marshal's staff; on the other the Duke of Suffolk. The Bishop of London, who performed the ceremony, received the infant at the church door of the Greyfriars, assisted by a grand company of bishops and mitred abbots, and, with all the rites of the Church of Rome, this future great Protestant queen received the name of her grandmother, Elizabeth of York. Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, was her godfather, and the Duchess of Norfolk and the Marchioness of Dorset her godmothers. After Elizabeth had received her name, Garter, King-at-Arms, cried aloud, "God in his infinite goodness send a prosperous life and long to the high and mighty Princess of England, Elizabeth." Then a flourish of trumpets sounded, and the royal child was borne to the altar. The Gospel was read over her, and she was confirmed by Cranmer, who, with the other sponsors, presented the christening gifts. He gave her a standing cup of gold, the Duchess of Norfolk a cup of gold fretted with pearls, being completely unconscious of the chemical antipathy between the acidity of wine and the misplaced pearls. The Marchioness of Dorset gave 3 gilt bowls, pounced with a cover, and the Marchioness of Exeter 3 standing bowls, graven and gilt, with covers. Then were brought in wafers, comfits, and hippocras, in such abundance that the company had as much as could be desired. The homeward procession was lighted on its way to the palace with 500 staff torches, which were carried by the yeomen of the guard and the king's servants, but the infant herself was surrounded by gentlemen bearing wax flambeaux. The procession returned in the same order that it went out, save that 4 noble gentlemen carried the sponsor's gifts before the child, with trumpets flourishing all the way preceding them, till they came to the door of the Queen's chamber. The King commanded the Duke of Norfolk to thank the Lord Mayor and citizens heartily in his name for their attendance, and after they had powerfully refreshed themselves in the royal cellar, they betook themselves to their barges. The Queen was desirous of nourishing her infant daughter from her own bosom, but Henry, with his characteristic selfishness, forbade it, lest the frequent presence of the little princess in the chamber of her royal mother should be attended with inconvenience to himself. He appointed for Elizabeth's nurse the wife of a gentleman named Hockhart, whom he afterwards ennobled, and he invested the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk with the office of state governess to the newborn babe, giving her for a residence the fair mansion and all the rich furniture which he had bestowed on Anne Boleyn when he created her Marchioness of Pembroke, with a salary of 6,000 crowns. The Lady Margaret Bryan, whose husband Sir Thomas Bryan was a kinsman of Queen Anne Boleyn, was preferred to the office of governess in ordinary to Elizabeth, as she had formerly been to the Princess Mary. She was called the Lady Mistress. Elizabeth passed the first 2 months of her life at Greenwich Palace, with the Queen her mother, and during that period she was frequently taken for an airing to Eltham for the benefit of her health. On the 2nd of December she was the subject of the following order in council. The King's Highness hath appointed that the Lady Princess Elizabeth, almost 3 months old, shall be taken from hence towards Hatfield upon Wednesday next week, that on Wednesday night she is to lie and repose at the house of the Earl of Rutland at Enfield, and the next day to be conveyed to Hatfield, and there to remain with such household as the King's Highness has established for the same. Hertford Castle was first named, but scratched through and changed to Hatfield. A few weeks afterwards she became, in virtue of the Act of Parliament which settled the succession, in default of heirs male to Henry VIII, on the female issue of that monarch by Anne Boleyn, the heiress presumptive to the throne, and her disinherited sister, the Princess Mary, was compelled to yield precedency to her. Soon after this change in the prospects of the unconscious babe, she was removed to the palace of the Bishop of Winchester at Chelsea, on whom the charge of herself and her extensive nursery appointments were thrust. When she was 13 months old she was weaned, and the preliminaries for this important business were arranged between the officers of her household and the cabinet ministers of her august sire, with as much solemnity as if the fate of empires had been involved in the matter. The following passages are extracted from a letter from Sir William Powlett to Cromwell. Footnote: the King's chief minister. End of footnote. On this subject. The King's Grace, well considering the letter directed to you from my Lady Bryan and other my Lady Princess's officers, his Grace, with the assent of the Queen's Grace, hath fully determined the weaning of my Lady Princess to be done with all diligence. He proceeds to state that the little princess is to have the whole of any one of the royal residences thought best for her, and that consequently he has given orders for Langley to be put in order for her and her suite, which orders, he adds, this messenger hath, withal, a letter from the Queen's Grace to my Lady Bryan, and that his Grace and the Queen's Grace doth well and be merry, and all theirs, thanks be to God. From Sarum, October 9th. Scarcely was this nursery affair of state accomplished, before Henry exerted his paternal care in seeking to provide the royal weanling with a suitable consort, by entering into a negotiation with Francis I. of France, for a union between this infant princess and the Duke of Angoulême, the third son of that monarch. Henry proposed that the young duke should be educated in England, and stipulated that he should hold the Duchy of Angoulême independently of the French crown, in the event of his coming to the crown of England through his marriage with Elizabeth. The project of educating the young French prince, who was selected for the husband of the presumptive heiress of England, according to the manners and customs of the realm of which she might hereafter become the sovereign, was a sagacious idea, but Henry clogged the matrimonial treaty with conditions which it was out of the power of the King of France to ratify, and it proved abortive. By the sentence which Cranmer had passed on the marriage of her parents and her own birth, Elizabeth was branded with the stigma of illegitimacy, and that she was for a time exposed to the sort of neglect and contempt which is too often the lot of children to whom that reproach applies. is evidenced by the following letter from Lady Bryan to Cromwell, imploring for a supply of necessary raiment for the innocent babe who had been so cruelly involved in her mother's fall. My lord, after my most bounden duty, I recommend me to your good lordship, beseeching you to be good lord to me, now in the greatest need that ever was, for it hath pleased God to take me from them, that was my greatest comfort in this world, to my great heaviness. Jesu have mercy on her soul. And now I am succourless, and as a redless, without redress creature, but only from the great trust which I have in the king's grace and your good lordship, for now in you I put all my whole trust of comfort in this world, beseeching you to me that I may do so. My lord, when your lordship was last here, it pleased you to say I should not mistrust the king's grace nor your lordship, which word was more comfort to me than I can write, as God knoweth. And now it emboldens me to show you my poor mind. My lord, when my Lady Mary's grace was born, it pleased the king's grace to appoint me lady mistress, and made me a baroness, and so I have been governess to the children his grace have had since. Now it is so, my Lady Elizabeth is put from that degree she was afore, and what degree she is at of now I know not but by hearsay. Therefore I know not how to order her, nor myself, nor none of hers that I have the rule of, that is, her women and grooms, beseeching you to be good lord to my lady and to all hers, and that she may have some raiment. Here Strype has interpolated a query for mourning. There is nothing of the kind implied in the original. If Strype had consulted any female on the articles enumerated, he would have found that few, indeed, of them were requisite for mourning. The list shows the utter destitution the young princess had been suffered to fall into in regard to clothes, either by the neglect of her mother, or because Anne Boleyn's power of aiding her child had been circumscribed long before her fall. Let any lady used to the nursery read over the list of the poor child's wants, represented by her faithful governess, and consider that a 12-month must have elapsed since she had a new supply. She, continues Lady Bryan, hath neither gown, nor kirtle, slip, nor petticoat, nor no manner of linen, nor foresmocks, day chemises, nor kerchiefs, nor rails, night dresses, nor body stitchets, corsets, nor handkerchiefs, nor sleeves, nor mufflers, mob caps, nor biggins, nightcaps. All these her grace must take. I have driven off as long as I can, that by my troth I can drive it off no longer. Beseeching you, my lord, that ye will see that her grace may have that which is needful for her, as my trust is that ye will do. Beseeching ye, mine own good lord, that I may know from you by writing, how I shall order myself, and what is the king's grace's pleasure and yours, and that I shall do in everything. And whatsoever it shall please the king's grace or your lordship to command me at all times, I shall fulfill it to the best of my power. My lord, Mr. Shelton, a kinsman of Anne Boleyn, saith he be master of this house. What fashion that may be I cannot tell, for I have not seen it afore. My lord, ye be so honourable yourself, and every man reporteth that your lordship loveth honour, that I trust you will see the house honourably ordered, as it ever hath been aforetime. And if it please you that I may know what your order is, and if it be not performed, I shall certify your lordship of it. For I fear me it will be hardly enough performed. But if the head, evidently Shelton, knew what honour meaneth, it will be the better ordered. If not, it will be hard to bring to pass. My lord, Mr. Shelton would have my Lady Elizabeth to dine and sup every day at the board of his state. Alas, my lord, it is not meet for a child of her age to keep such rule yet. I promise you, my lord, I dare not take it upon me to keep her grace in health, and she keep that rule. For there she shall see divers meats, and fruits and wine, which it would be hard for me to restrain her grace from. Ye know, my lord, there is no place of correction there, and she is yet too young to correct greatly. I know well, an she be there, I shall neither bring her up to the king's grace's honour, nor hers, nor to her health, nor to my poor honesty. Wherefore I show your lordship this my desire, beseeching you, my lord, that my lady may have a mess of meat at her own lodging, with a good dish or two that is meat, fit, for her grace to eat of. And the reversion of the mess shall satisfy all her women, a gentleman usher and a groom, which be 11 persons on her side. Sure am I it will be as great profit to the king's grace this way, viz., to the economy of the arrangement, as the other way. For if all this should be set abroad, they must have 3 or 4 messes of meat, whereas this one mess shall suffice them all with bread and drink, according as my Lady Mary's grace had afore, and to be ordered in all things as her grace was afore. God knoweth my Lady Elizabeth hath great pain with her great teeth, and they come very slowly forth, which causeth me to suffer her grace to have her will more than I would. I trust to God and her teeth were well graft to have her grace after another fashion than she is yet, so as I trust the King's grace shall have great comfort in her grace. For she is as toward a child and as gentle of conditions as ever I knew any in my life. Jesu preserve her grace. As for a day or 2, at a high time, meaning a high festival, or whensoever it shall please the King's grace to have her set abroad, shown in public, I trust so to endeavour me, that she shall do so as shall be to the King's honour and hers, and then after to take her ease again. That is, notwithstanding the sufferings of the young Elizabeth with her teeth, if the King wishes to exhibit her for a short time in public, Lady Bryan will answer for her discreet behaviour, but after the drilling requisite for such ceremonial, it will be necessary for her to revert to the unconstrained playfulness of childhood. Lady Bryan concludes with this remark: I think Mr. Shelton will not be content with this. He need not know it is my desire, but that it is the King's pleasure and yours that it should be so. Good my lord, have my lady's grace, and us that be her poor servants, in your remembrance, and your lordship shall have our hearty prayers by the grace of Jesu, who ever preserve your lordship with long life and as much honour as your noble heart can desire. From Hunsdon, with the evil hand, bad writing, of her who is your daily beadwoman, Margaret Bryan. I beseech you, mine own good lord, be not miscontent that I am so bold to write thus to your lordship. But I take God to my judge, I do it of true heart, and for my discharge, beseeching you, accept my good mind, endorsed to the right noble and my singular good lord, my Lord Privy Seal, be this delivered. This letter affords some insight into the domestic politics of the nursery palace at Hunsdon at this time. It shows that the infant Elizabeth proved a point of controversy between the 2 principal officers there, Margaret Lady Bryan and Mr. Shelton, both placed in authority by the recently immolated Queen Anne Boleyn, and both related to her family. Her aunt had married the head of the Shelton or Skelton family in Norfolk, and this officer at Hunsdon was probably a son of that lady, and consequently a near kinsman of the infant Elizabeth. He insisted that she should dine and sup at a state table, where her infant importunity for wine, fruit, and high-seasoned food could not conveniently be restrained by her sensible governess, Lady Bryan. Shelton probably wished to keep regal state as long as possible round the descendant of the Boleyns, and in that time of sudden change in royal destinies, had perhaps an eye to ingratiate himself with the infant, by appearing in her company twice every day, and indulging her by the gratification of her palate with mischievous dainties. Lady Bryan was likewise connected with the Boleyn family, not so near as the Sheltons, but near enough to possess interest with Queen Anne Boleyn, to whom she owed her office as governess or lady mistress to the infant Elizabeth. There can scarcely exist a doubt that her lamentation and invocation for the soul of some person lately departed, by whose death she was left succourless, refer to the recent death of Anne Boleyn. It is evident that if Lady Bryan had not conformed to King Henry's version of the Catholic religion, she would not have been in authority at Hunsdon, where she was abiding not only with her immediate charge, the Princess Elizabeth, but with the disinherited Princess Mary. Further, there may be observed a striking harmony between the expressions of this lady and those of the Princess Mary, who appealed to her father's paternal feelings in behalf of her sister, the infant Elizabeth, a few weeks later, almost in the same words used by Lady Bryan in this letter. A coincidence which proves unity of purpose between the governess and the Princess Mary regarding the motherless child. Much of the future greatness of Elizabeth may reasonably be attributed to the judicious training of her sensible and conscientious governess, combined with the salutary adversity which deprived her of the pernicious pomp and luxury that had surrounded her cradle while she was treated as the heiress of England. The first public action of Elizabeth's life was her carrying the chrism of her infant brother, Edward VI, at the christening solemnity of that prince. She was born in the arms of the Earl of Hertford, brother of the Queen her stepmother, when the assistants in the ceremonial approached the font. But when they left the chapel, the train of her little Grace, just 4 years old, was supported by Lady Herbert, the sister of Catherine Parr, as, led by the hand of her elder sister, the Princess Mary, she walked with mimic dignity in the returning procession to the chamber of the dying Queen. At that period the royal ceremonials of Henry VIII's court were blended with circumstances of wonder and tragic excitement, and strange and passing sad it must have been to see the child of the murdered Queen, Anne Boleyn, framing her innocent lips to lisp the name of mother to her for whose sake she had been rendered motherless, and branded with the stigma of illegitimacy. In all probability the little Elizabeth knelt to her, as well as to her cruel father, to claim a benediction in her turn, after the royal pair had proudly bestowed their blessing on the newly baptized prince, whose christening was so soon to be followed by the funeral of the Queen his mother. It was deemed an especial mark in the favour of her royal father that Elizabeth was considered worthy of the honour of being admitted to keep company with the young prince, her brother. She was 4 years older than he, and having been well trained and gently nurtured herself, was better able, says Heywood, to teach and direct him, even from the first of his speech and understanding. Cordial and entire was the affection betwixt this brother and sister, insomuch that he no sooner began to know her but he seemed to acknowledge her, and she, being of more maturity, as deeply loved him. On the 2nd anniversary of Edward's birth, when the nobles of England presented gifts of silver and gold and jewels to the infant heir of the realm, the Lady Elizabeth's Grace gave the simple offering of a shirt of cambric worked by her own hands. She was then 6 years old. Thus early was this illustrious lady instructed in the feminine accomplishment of needlework, and directed to turn her labours in that way to a pleasing account. From her cradle Elizabeth was a child of the fairest promise, and possessed the art of attracting the regard of others. Wriothesley, who visited the two princesses when they were together at Hertford Castle, December 17, 1539, was greatly impressed with the precocious understanding of the young Elizabeth, of whom he gives the following pretty account. I went then to my Lady Elizabeth's Grace, and to the same made his Majesty's most hearty commendations, declaring that his Highness desired to hear of her health, and sent his blessing. She gave humble thanks, inquiring after his Majesty's welfare, and that with as great a gravity as if she had been 40 years old. If she be no worse educated than she now appeareth to me, she will prove of no less honour than beseemeth her father's daughter, whom the Lord long preserve. End of section 74. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
Section 75 of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The World Story, Volume 9, England, edited by Eva March Tappan, Section 75. Sir Walter Raleigh and His Cloak, 1575, by Sir Walter Scott. There is no period at which men look worse in the eyes of each other, or feel more uncomfortable, than when the first dawn of daylight finds them watchers. Even a beauty of the first order, after the vigils of a ball are interrupted by the dawn, would do wisely to withdraw herself from the gaze of her fondest and most partial admirers. Such was the pale, inauspicious, and ungrateful light which began to beam upon those who kept watch all night in the hall at Sayes Court, and which mingled its cold, pale blue diffusion with the red, yellow, and smoky beams of expiring lamps and torches. The young gallant had left the room for a few minutes to learn the cause of a knocking at the outward gate, and on his return was so struck with the forlorn and ghastly aspects of his companions of the watch that he exclaimed, "Pity of my heart, my masters, how like owls you look! Methinks when the sun rises I shall see you flutter off with your eyes dazzled to stick yourselves into the next ivy tod or ruined steeple." "Hold thy peace, thou gibing fool," said Blunt. "Hold thy peace. Is this a time for jeering, when the manhood of England is perchance dying within a wall's breadth of thee?" "There thou liest," replied the gallant. "How lie?" exclaimed Blunt, starting up. "Lie, and to me? Why, so thou didst, thou peevish fool, answered the youth. Thou didst lie on that bench even now, didst thou not? But art thou not a hasty coxcomb to pick up a wry word so wrathfully? Nevertheless, loving and honoring my lord, as truly as thou, or any one, I do say, that should heaven take him from us, all England's manhood dies not with him. Ay, replied Blunt, a good portion will survive with thee, doubtless, and a good portion with thyself, Blunt, and with stout Markham here, and Tracy, and all of us. But I'm he will best employ the talent heaven has given to us all. As how, I prithee? Said Blunt, tell us your mystery of multiplying. Why, sirs, answered the youth, ye are like goodly land which bears no crop, because it is not quickened by manure. But I have that rising spirit in me which will make my poor faculties labor to keep pace with it. My ambition will keep my brain at work, I warrant thee. I pray to God it does not drive thee mad, said Blunt. For my part, if we lose our noble lord, I bid adieu to the court and to the camp both. I have 500 foul acres in Norfolk, and thither will I, and change the court pantoufle for the country hobnail. O base transmutation, exclaimed his antagonist, thou hast already got the true rustic slouch. Thy shoulders stoop as if thine hands were at the stilts of the plough, and thou hast a kind of earthly smell about thee, instead of being perfumed with essence as a gallant and courtier should. On my soul, thou hast stolen out to roll thyself on a hay mow. Thy only excuse will be to swear by thy hilts that the farmer had a fair daughter. I pray thee, Walter, said another of the company, cease thy raillery, which suits neither time nor place, and tell us who was at the gate just now. Dr. Masters, physician to her grace in ordinary, sent by her special orders to inquire after the Earl's health, answered Walter. Ha, what? Exclaimed Tracy, that was no slight mark of favor. If the Earl can but come through, he will match with Leicester yet. Is Masters with my lord at present? Nay, replied Walter, he is halfway back to Greenwich by this time, and in high dudgeon. Thou didst not refuse him admittance, exclaimed Tracy. Thou wert not surely so mad, ejaculated Blunt. I refused him admittance as flatly, Blunt, as you would refuse a penny to a blind beggar, as obstinately, Tracy, as thou didst ever deny access to a dun. Why, in the fiend's name, didst thou trust him to go to the gate? Said Blunt to Tracy. It suited his years better than mine, answered Tracy, but he has undone us all now thoroughly. My lord may live or die, he will never have a look of favor from her majesty again. Nor the means of making fortunes for his followers, said the young gallant, smiling contemptuously. There lies the sore point that will brook no handling. My good sirs, I sounded my lamentations over my lord somewhat less loudly than some of you, but when the point comes of doing him service, I will yield to none of you. Had this learned leech entered, thinkst thou not there had been such a coil betwixt him and Tressilian's mediciner, that not the sleeper only, but the very dead might have awakened? I know what larum belongs to the discord of doctors. And who is to take the blame of opposing the Queen's orders? Said Tracy, for undeniably Dr. Masters came with her Grace's positive commands to cure the Earl. I, who have done the wrong, will bear the blame, said Walter. Thus then, off fly the dreams of court favor thou hast nourished, said Blunt, and despite all thy boasted art and ambition, Devonshire will see thee shine a true younger brother, fit to sit low at the board, carve turnabout, with the chaplain, look that the hounds be fed, and see the squire's girths drawn when he goes a-hunting. Not so, said the young man, coloring, not while Ireland and the Netherlands have wars, and not while the sea hath pathless waves. The rich West hath lands undreamed of, and Britain contains bold hearts to venture on the quest of them. Adieu for a space, my masters, I go to walk in the court, and look to the sentinels. The lad hath quicksilver in his veins, that is certain, said Blunt, looking at Markham. He hath that both in brain and blood, said Markham, which may either make or mar him. but in closing the door against masters he hath done a daring and loving piece of service. For Tressilian's fellow hath ever averred that to wake the earl were death, and masters would wake the 7 sleepers themselves if he thought they slept not, by the regular ordinance of medicine. Morning was well advanced when Tressilian, fatigued and overwatched, came down to the hall with the joyful intelligence that the earl had awakened of himself, that he found his internal complaints much mitigated, and spoke with a cheerfulness and looked round with a vivacity, which of themselves showed a material and favorable change had taken place. Tressilian at the same time commanded the attendance of 1 or 2 of his followers to report what had passed during the night, and to relieve the watchers in the earl's chamber. When the message of the queen was communicated to the Earl of Sussex, he at first smiled at the repulse which the physician had received from his zealous young follower, but instantly recollecting himself, he commanded Blunt, his master of the horse, instantly to take boat and go down the river to the Palace of Greenwich, taking young Walter and Tracy with him, and make a suitable compliment expressing his grateful thanks to his sovereign, and mentioning the cause why he had not been enabled to profit by the assistance of the wise and learned Dr. Masters. A plague on it, said Blunt, as he descended the stairs. Had he sent me with a cartel to Leicester, I think I should have done his errand indifferently well, but to go to our gracious sovereign, before whom all words must be lacquered over, either with gilding or with sugar, is such a confectionary matter as clean baffles my poor old English brain. Come with me, Tracy, and come you too, Master Walter Witty Pate, that art the cause of our having all this ado. Let us see if thy neat brain, that frames so many flashy fireworks, can help out a plain fellow at need with some of thy shrewd devices. Never fear, exclaimed the youth. It is I will help you through. Let me but fetch my cloak. Why, thou hast it on thy shoulders, said Blunt. The lad is mazed. No, this is Tracy's old mantle, answered Walter. I go not with thee to court unless as a gentleman should. Why, said Blunt, thy braveries are like to dazzle the eyes of none but some poor groom or porter. I know that, said the youth, but I am resolved I will have my own cloak, ay, and brush my doublet to boot, ere I stir forth with you. Well, said Blunt, here is a coil about a doublet and a cloak. Get thyself ready, a God's name. They were soon launched on the princely bosom of the broad Thames, upon which the sun now shone forth in all its splendor. There are 2 things scarce matched in the universe, said Walter de Blunt, the sun in heaven and the Thames on the earth. The one will light us to Greenwich well enough, said Blunt, and the other would take us there a little faster if it were ebb tide. And this is all thou thinkst, all thou carest, all thou deemst the use of the king of elements and the king of rivers to guide 3 such poor caitiffs as thyself and me and Tracy upon an idle journey of courtly ceremony? It is no errand of my seeking, faith, replied Blunt, and I could excuse both the sun and the Thames the trouble of carrying me where I have no great mind to go, and where I expect but dog's wages for my trouble. And by my honour, he added, looking out from the head of the boat, it seems to me as if our message were a sort of labour in vain, for see, the Queen's barge lies at the stairs as if Her Majesty were about to take water. It was even so. The royal barge, manned with the Queen's watermen, richly attired in the regal liveries, and having the banner of England displayed, did indeed lie at the great stairs, which ascended from the river, and along with it 2 or 3 other boats for transporting such part of her retinue as were not in immediate attendance on the royal person. The yeomen of the guard, the tallest and most handsome men whom England could produce, guarded, with their halberds, the passage from the palace gate to the river side, and all seemed in readiness for the Queen's coming forth, although the day was yet so early. By my faith, this bodes us no good, said Blunt. It must be some perilous cause puts her grace in motion thus untimeously. By my counsel, we were best put back again and tell the Earl what we have seen. Tell the Earl what we have seen, said Walter. Why, what have we seen but a boat, and men with scarlet jerkins, and halberds in their hands? Let us do his errand, and tell him what the Queen says in reply. So saying, he caused the boat to be pulled toward a landing place at some distance from the principal one, which it would not at that moment have been thought respectful to approach, and jumped on shore, followed though with reluctance by his cautious and timid companions. As they approached the gate of the palace, one of the sergeant porters told them they could not at present enter, as Her Majesty was in the act of coming forth. The gentleman used the name of the Earl of Sussex, but it proved no charm to subdue the officer who alleged in reply that it was as much as his post was worth to disobey in the least tittle the commands which he had received. Nay, I told you as much before, said Blount. Do I pray you, my dear Walter, let us take boat and return. Not till I see the queen come forth, returned the youth composedly. Thou art mad, stark mad, by the mass, answered Blount. And thou, said Walter, art turned coward of the sudden. I have seen thee face half a score of shag-headed Irish kerns, to thy own share of them, and now thou wouldst blink and go back to shun the frown of a fair lady. At this moment the gates opened, and ushers began to issue forth in array, preceded and flanked by the band of gentlemen pensioners. After this, amid a crowd of lords and ladies, yet so disposed around her that she could see and be seen on all sides, came Elizabeth herself, then in the prime of womanhood, and in the full glow of what in a sovereign was called beauty, and who would in the lowest rank of life have been truly judged a noble figure, joined to a striking and commanding physiognomy. She leaned on the arm of Lord Hunsdon, whose relation to her by her mother's side often procured him such distinguished marks of Elizabeth's intimacy. The young cavalier we have so often mentioned had probably never yet approached so near the person of his sovereign, and he pressed forward as far as the line of warders permitted, in order to avail himself of the present opportunity. His companion, on the contrary, cursing his imprudence, kept pulling him backward, till Walter shook him off impatiently, and letting his rich cloak drop carelessly from one shoulder, a natural action which served, however, to display to the best advantage his well-proportioned person. Unbonneting at the same time, he fixed his eager gaze on the queen's approach with a mixture of respectful curiosity and modest yet ardent admiration, which suited so well with his fine features, that the warders, struck with his rich attire and noble countenance, suffered him to approach the ground over which the queen was to pass somewhat closer than was permitted to ordinary spectators. Thus the adventurous youth stood full in Elizabeth's eye, an eye never indifferent to the admiration which she deservedly excited among her subjects, or to the fair proportions of external form which chanced to distinguish any of her courtiers. Accordingly, she fixed her keen glance on the youth as she approached the place where he stood, with a look in which surprise at his boldness seemed to be unmingled with resentment, while a trifling accident happened which attracted her attention toward him yet more strongly. The night had been rainy, and just where the young gentleman stood, a small quantity of mud interrupted the queen's passage. As she hesitated to pass on, the gallant, throwing his cloak from his shoulders, laid it on the miry spot, so as to ensure her stepping over it dry shod. Elizabeth looked at the young man, who accompanied this act of devoted courtesy with a profound reverence and a blush that overspread his whole countenance. The queen was confused, and blushed in her turn, nodded her head, hastily passed on, and embarked in her barge without saying a word. "Come along, Sir Coxcomb," said Blount. "Your gay cloak will need the brush to-day, I wot. Nay, if you had meant to make a foot-cloth of your mantle, better have kept Tracy's old drab de Boer, which despises all colours. This cloak," said the youth, taking it up and folding it, "shall never be brushed while in my possession, and that will not be long if you learn not a little more economy. We shall have you in cuerpo soon, as the Spaniard says." Their discourse was here interrupted by one of the band of pensioners. "I was sent," said he, after looking at them attentively, "to a gentleman who hath no cloak, or a muddy one. You, sir, I think," addressing the younger cavalier, "are the man. You will please to follow me." "He is in attendance on me," said Blount. "On me, the noble Earl of Sussex, master of horse." "I have nothing to say to that," answered the messenger. "My orders are directly from her Majesty, and concern this gentleman only." So saying, he walked away, followed by Walter, leaving the others behind, Blount's eyes almost starting from his head with the excess of his astonishment. At length he gave vent to it in an exclamation. "Who the good jeer would have thought this?" And shaking his head with a mysterious air, he walked to his own boat, embarked, and returned to Deptford. The young cavalier was in the meanwhile guided to the waterside by the pensioner, who showed him considerable respect, a circumstance which, to persons in his situation, may be considered as an augury of no small consequence. He ushered him into one of the wherries, which lay ready to attend the queen's barge, which was already proceeding up the river, with the advantage of that flood tide of which, in the course of their descent, Blount had complained to his associates. The two rowers used their oars with such expedition, at the signal of the gentleman pensioner, that they very soon brought their little skiff under the stern of the queen's boat, where she sat beneath an awning, attended by 2 or 3 ladies and the nobles of her household. She looked more than once at the wherry in which the young adventurer was seated, spoke to those around her, and seemed to laugh. At length one of the attendants, by the Queen's order, apparently made a sign for the wherry to come alongside, and the young man was desired to step from his own skiff into the Queen's barge, an act which he performed with graceful agility at the forepart of the boat, and was brought aft to the Queen's presence, the wherry at the same time dropping into the rear. The youth underwent the gaze of majesty not the less gracefully than his self-position was mingled with embarrassment. The muddy cloak still hung upon his arm, and formed the natural topic with which the Queen introduced the conversation. "You have this day spoiled a gay mantle in our behalf, young man. We thank you for your service, though the manner of offering it was unusual and something bold." "In a sovereign's need," answered the youth, "it is each liegeman's duty to be bold." "God's pity, that was well said, my lord," said the Queen, turning to a grave person who sat by her, and answered with a grave inclination of the head and something of a mumbled assent. "Well, young man, your gallantry shall not go unrewarded. Go to the wardrobe keeper, and he shall have orders to supply the suit which you have cast away in our service. Thou shalt have a suit, and that of the newest cut, I promise thee, on the word of a princess." "May it please your grace," said Walter, hesitating, "it is not for so humble a servant of your majesty to measure out your bounties, but if it became me to choose—" "Thou wouldst have gold, I warrant me," said the Queen, interrupting him. "Fie, young man, I take shame to say that in our capital such and so various are the means of thriftless folly, that to give gold to youth is giving fuel to fire, and furnishing them with the means of self-destruction. If I live and reign, these means of unchristian excess shall be abridged. Yet thou mayest be poor," she added, "or thy parents may be. It shall be gold, if thou wilt, but thou shalt answer to me for the use on't." Walter waited patiently until the Queen had done, and then modestly assured her that gold was still less in his wish than the raiment her majesty had before offered. "How, boy," said the Queen, "neither gold nor garment? What is it thou wouldst have of me, then?" "Only permission, madam, if it is not asking too high an honor, permission to wear the cloak which did you this trifling service." "Permission to wear thine own cloak, thou silly boy," said the Queen. "It is no longer mine," said Walter. "When your majesty's foot touched it, it became a fit mantle for a prince, but far too rich a one for its former owner." The Queen again blushed, and endeavored to cover, by laughing, a slight degree of not unpleasing surprise and confusion. "Heard you ever the like, my lords? The youth's head is turned with reading romances. I must know something of him, that I may send him safe to his friends. What art thou?" "A gentleman of the household of the Earl of Sussex, so please your grace, sent hither with his master of horse upon a message to your majesty." In a moment the gracious expression which Elizabeth's face had hitherto maintained gave way to an expression of haughtiness and severity. "My Lord of Sussex," she said, "has taught us how to regard his messages by the value he places upon ours. We sent but this morning the physician in ordinary of our chamber, and that at no usual time, understanding his lordship's illness to be more dangerous than we had before apprehended. There is at no court in Europe a man more skilled in this holy and most useful science than Dr. Masters, and he came from us to our subject. Nevertheless he found the gate of Sayes Court defended by men with culverins, as if it had been on the borders of Scotland, not in the vicinity of our court, and when he demanded admittance in our name, it was stubbornly refused. For this slight of a kindness which had but too much of condescension in it, we will receive at present at least no excuse, and some such we suppose to have been the purport of my Lord of Sussex's message." This was uttered in a tone and with a gesture which made Lord Sussex's friends, who were within hearing, tremble. He to whom the speech was addressed, however, trembled not, but with great deference and humility, as soon as the Queen's passion gave him an opportunity, he replied, "So please your most gracious majesty, I was charged with no apology from the Earl of Sussex." "With what were you then charged, sir?" said the Queen, with the impetuosity which, amid nobler qualities, strongly marked her character. "Was it with a justification, or God's death with a defiance?" "Madam," said the young man, "my Lord of Sussex knew the offence approached toward treason, and could think of nothing save of securing the offender and placing him in your majesty's hands and at your mercy. The noble earl was fast asleep when your most gracious message reached him, a potion having been administered to that purpose by his physician, and his lordship knew not of the ungracious repulse your majesty's royal and most comfortable message had received until after he awoke this morning." And which of his domestics then, in the name of heaven, presumed to reject my message without even admitting my own physician to the presence of him whom I sent him to attend? Said the queen, much surprised. The offender, madam, is before you, replied Walter, bowing very low. The full and sole blame is mine, and my lord has most justly sent me to abide the consequences of a fault of which he is as innocent as a sleeping man's dreams can be of a waking man's actions. What, was it thou thyself, that repelled my messenger and my physician from Say's court? Said the queen, what could occasion such boldness in one who seems devoted, that is, whose exterior bearing shows devotion to his sovereign? Madam, said the youth, who, notwithstanding an assumed appearance of severity, thought that he saw something in the queen's face that resembled not implacability, we say in our country that the physician is for the time the liege sovereign of his patient. Now my noble master was then under dominion of a leech, by whose advice he hath greatly profited, who had issued his commands that his patient should not that night be disturbed on the very peril of his life. Thy master hath trusted some false varlet of an empiric, said the queen. I know not, madam, but by the fact that he is now this very morning awakened, much refreshed and strengthened from the only sleep he hath had for many hours. The nobles looked at each other, but more with the purpose to see what each thought of this news than to exchange any remarks on what had happened. The queen answered hastily and without affecting to disguise her satisfaction. By my word, I am glad he is better. But thou wert overbold to deny the access of my Dr. Masters. Knowest thou not the Holy Writ saith, in the multitude of counsel there is safety? Ay, madam, said Walter, but I have heard learned men say that the safety spoken of is for the physicians, not for the patient. By my faith, child, thou hast pushed me home, said the queen, laughing, for my Hebrew learning does not come quite at a call. How say you, my Lord of Lincoln? Hath the lad given a just interpretation of the text? The word safety, most gracious madam, said the Bishop of Lincoln, for so hath been translated, it may be somewhat hastily, the Hebrew word being. My lord, said the queen, interrupting him, we said we had forgotten our Hebrew. But for thee, young man, what is thy name and birth? Raleigh is my name, most gracious queen, the youngest son of a large but honorable family of Devonshire. Raleigh, said Elizabeth, after a moment's recollection, have we not heard of your service in Ireland? I have been so fortunate as to do some service there, madam, replied Raleigh, scarce, however, of consequence sufficient to reach your graces is. They hear farther than you think of, said the queen graciously, and have heard of a youth who defended a fort in Shannon against a whole band of wild Irish rebels, until the stream ran purple with their blood and his own. Some blood I may have lost, said the youth, looking down, but it was where my best is due, and that is in your majesty's service. The queen paused, and then said hastily, you are very young to have fought so well and to speak so well, but you must not escape your penance for turning back masters. The poor man hath caught cold in the river, for our order reached him when he was just returned from certain visits in London, and he held it matter of loyalty and conscience instantly to set forth again. So hark ye, Master Raleigh, see thou fail not to wear thy muddy cloak in token of penitence, till our pleasure be farther known. And here, she added, giving him a jewel of gold in the form of a chessman, I give thee this to wear at the collar. Raleigh, to whom nature had taught intuitively, as it were, those courtly arts which many scarce acquire from long experience, knelt, and as he took from her hand the jewel, kissed the fingers which gave it. He knew perhaps better than almost any of the courtiers who surrounded her how to mingle the devotion claimed by the queen with the gallantry due to her personal beauty. And in this, his first attempt to unite them, he succeeded so well as at once to gratify Elizabeth's personal vanity and her love of power. End of section 75. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 76 of England, read for LibriVox.org by Sarah Brown. The Boyhood of Raleigh, by Sir John Everett Millais, English painter, 1829 to 1896. Painting, page 518. The illustration represents a scene that is common enough on any coast. Two boys listening to a sailor's rehearsal of his adventures. But one of these boys is supposed to be Sir Walter Raleigh, and the adventures are supposed to have taken place on the wonderful Western Ocean. When Raleigh had grown up, he was eager to go forth upon the sea. Unfortunately for his wishes, he became a favorite of Queen Elizabeth, and this sovereign had no idea of permitting her favorites to leave the country. Wealth and power came to him, and he was able to send out expeditions of discovery. But it was not until after many years that he was allowed to visit the unknown continent across the seas. On this voyage, he sailed up the Orinoco for 400 miles. Raleigh fell out of the royal favor, his enemies were active, and although after a time he was restored to the favor of the Queen, yet when James I came to the throne, he was sent to the Tower on a charge of being privy to plots against the king. Here he wrote his famous History of the World. In 1616, he was allowed to make a voyage to the Orinoco to search for a gold mine. The gold mine was not found, and on his return, he was executed on the old charge of treason. End of section 76. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 77 of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. The World Story, Volume 9. England. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 77. When Elizabeth Came to Kenilworth, 1575. By Sir Walter Scott. It was the twilight of a summer night, 9th July, 1575, the sun having for some time set, and all were in anxious expectation of the Queen's immediate approach. The multitude had remained assembled for many hours, and their numbers were still rather on the increase. A profuse distribution of refreshments, together with roasted oxen, and barrels of ale set abroach in different places of the road, had kept the populace in perfect love and loyalty toward the Queen and her favourite, which might have somewhat abated had fasting been added to watching. They passed away the time, therefore, with the usual popular amusements of whooping, hallooing, shrieking, and playing rude tricks upon each other, forming the chorus of discordant sounds usual on such occasions. These prevailed all through the crowded roads and fields, and especially beyond the gate of the Chase, where the greater number of the common sort were stationed, when all of a sudden a single rocket was seen to shoot into the atmosphere, and at the instant, far heard over the flood and field, the great bell of the castle tolled. Immediately there was a pause of dead silence, succeeded by a deep hum of expectation, the united voice of many thousands, none of whom spoke above their breath, or, to use a singular expression, the whisper of an immense multitude. "They come now for certain," said Raleigh. "Tressilian, that sound is grand. We hear it from this distance as mariners after a long voyage hear, upon their night watch, the tide rush upon some distant and unknown shore." "Mass," answered Blunt, "I hear it rather as I used to hear mine own kine lowing from the close of Witten's Westlow." "He will assuredly graze presently," said Raleigh to Tressilian. "His thought is all of fat oxen and fertile meadows. He grows little better than one of his own beeves, and only becomes grand when he is provoked to pushing and goring." "We shall have him at that presently," said Tressilian, "if you spare not your wit." "Tush, I care not," answered Raleigh. "But thou, too, Tressilian, hast turned a kind of owl that flies only by night, hast exchanged thy songs for screechings, and good company for an ivy-tod." "But what manner of animal art thou thyself, Raleigh," said Tressilian, "that thou holdest us all so lightly?" "Who, I?" replied Raleigh. "An eagle am I, that never will think of dull earth while there is a heaven to soar in and a sun to gaze upon." "Well bragged, by St. Barnaby," said Blunt. "But, good Master Eagle, beware the cage, and beware the fowler. Many birds have flown as high that I have seen stuffed with straw and hung up to scare kites. But hark, what a dead silence hath fallen on them at once." "The procession pauses," said Raleigh, "at the gate of the Chase, where a Sibyl, one of the Fetidicae, meets the Queen to tell her fortune. I saw the verses, there is little savour in them, and her Grace has been already crammed full with such poetical compliments. She whispered to me during the Recorder's speech yonder at Ford Mill, as she entered the liberties of Warwick, how she was pertesa barbare laquelle." "The Queen whispered to him?" said Blunt, in a kind of soliloquy. "Good God, to what will this world come?" His further meditations were interrupted by a shout of applause from the multitude, so tremendously vociferous that the country echoed for miles round. The guards, thickly stationed upon the road by which the Queen was to advance, caught up the acclamation, which ran like wildfire to the castle, and announced to all within that Queen Elizabeth had entered the royal chase of Kenilworth. The whole music of the castle sounded at once, and a round of artillery, with a salvo of small arms, was discharged from the battlements. But the noise of drums and trumpets, and even of the cannon themselves, were but faintly heard amidst the roaring and reiterating welcomes of the multitude. As the noise began to abate, a broad glare of light was seen to appear from the gate of the park, and, broadening and brightening as it came nearer, advanced along the open and fair avenue that led toward the gallery tower, which, as we have already noticed, was lined on either hand by the retainers of the Earl of Leicester. The word was passed along the line, "The Queen! The Queen! Silence, and stand fast!" Onward came the cavalcade, illuminated by 200 thick waxen torches, in the hands of as many horsemen, which cast a light like that of broad day all around the procession, but especially on the principal group, of which the Queen herself, arrayed in the most splendid manner, and blazing with jewels, formed the central figure. She was mounted on a milk-white horse, which she reined with peculiar grace and dignity, and in the whole of her stately and noble carriage you saw the daughter of 100 kings. The ladies of the court who rode beside Her Majesty had taken especial care that their own external appearance should not be more glorious than their rank and the occasion altogether demanded, so that no inferior luminary might appear to approach the orbit of royalty. But their personal charms, and the magnificence by which, under every prudential restraint, they were necessarily distinguished, exhibited them as the very flower of a realm so far famed for splendor and beauty. The magnificence of the courtiers, free from such restraints as prudence imposed on the ladies, was yet more unbounded. Leicester, who glittered like a golden image with jewels and cloth of gold, rode on Her Majesty's right hand, as well in quality of her host as of her master of the horse. The black steed which he mounted had not a single white hair on his body, and was one of the most renowned chargers in Europe, having been purchased by the Earl at large expense for this royal occasion. As the noble animal chafed at the slow pace of the procession, and arching his stately neck, champed on the silver bits which restrained him, the foam flew from his mouth and specked his well-formed limbs, as if with spots of snow. The rider well became the high place which he held, and the proud steed which he bestrode, for no man in England, or perhaps in Europe, was more perfect than Dudley in horsemanship and all other exercises belonging to his quality. He was bareheaded, as were all the courtiers in the train, and the red torchlight shone upon his long curled tresses of dark hair, and on his noble features, to the beauty of which even the severest criticism could only object the lordly fault, as it may be termed, of a forehead somewhat too high. On that proud evening those features wore all the graceful solicitude of a subject to show himself sensible of the high honor which the Queen was conferring on him, and all the pride and satisfaction which became so glorious a moment. Yet, though neither eye nor feature betrayed aught but feelings which suited the occasion, some of the Earl's personal attendants remarked that he was unusually pale, and they expressed to each other their fear that he was taking more fatigue than consisted with his health. Varney followed close behind his master, as the principal esquire in waiting, and had charge of his lordship's black velvet bonnet, garnished with a clasp of diamonds and surmounted by a white plume. He kept his eye constantly on his master, and, for reasons with which the reader is not unacquainted, was among Leicester's numerous dependents the one who was most anxious that his lord's strength and resolution should carry him successfully through a day so agitating. For although Varney was one of the few, the very few, moral monsters who contrive to lull to sleep the remorse of their own bosoms, and are drugged into moral insensibility by atheism, as men in extreme agony are lulled by opium, yet he knew that in the breast of his patron there was already awakened the fire that is never quenched, and that his lord felt, amid all the pomp and magnificence we have described, the gnawing of the worm that dieth not. Still, however, assured as Lord Leicester stood by Varney's own intelligence that his countess laboured under an indisposition which formed an unanswerable apology to the Queen, for her not appearing at Kenilworth, there was little danger, his wily retainer thought, that a man so ambitious would betray himself by giving way to any external weakness. The train, male and female, who attended immediately upon the Queen's person, were, of course, of the bravest and the fairest, the highest-born nobles and the wisest counsellors of that distinguished reign, to repeat whose names were but to weary the reader. Behind came a long crowd of knights and gentlemen, whose rank and birth, however distinguished, were thrown into the shade, as their persons into the rear of a procession whose front was of such august majesty. Thus marshalled, the cavalcade approached the Gallery Tower, which formed, as we have often observed, the extreme barrier of the castle. It was now the part of the huge porter to step forward, but the lubbard was so overwhelmed with confusion of spirit, the contents of one immense blackjack of double ale, which he had just drank to quicken his memory, having treacherously confused the brain it was intended to clear, that he only groaned piteously, and remained sitting in his stone seat. And the Queen would have passed on without greeting, had not the gigantic warder's secret ally, Flibbertigibbet, who lay perdu behind him, thrust a pin into the rear of his short femoral garment. The porter uttered a sort of a yell, which came not amiss into his part, started up with his club, and dealt a sound douse or two on each side of him, and then, like a coach horse pricked by the spur, started off at once into the full career of his address, and by dint of active prompting on the part of Dicky Sludge, delivered, in sounds of gigantic intonation, a speech which may be thus abridged, the reader being to suppose that the first lines were addressed to the throng who approached the gateway, the conclusion at the approach of the Queen, upon sight of whom, as struck by some heavenly vision, the gigantic warder dropped his club, resigned his keys, and gave open way to the goddess of the night and all her magnificent train. What stir, what turmoil have we for the nones? Stand back, my masters, or beware your bones. Sirs, I'm a warder, and no man of straw. My voice keeps order, and my club gives law. Yet soft, nay stay, what vision have we here? What dainty darling's this? What peerless peer? What loveliest face that loving ranks enfold, like brightest diamond chased in purest gold? Dazzled and blind, mine office I forsake, my club, my key, my knee, my homage take. Bright paragon, pass on in joy and bliss, beshrew the gate that opes not wide at such a sight as this. Elizabeth received most graciously the homage of the Herculean porter, and, bending her head to him in requital, passed through his guarded tower, from the top of which was poured a clamorous blast of warlike music, which was replied to by other bands of minstrelsy placed at different points on the castle walls, and by others again stationed in the chase, while the tones of the one, as they yet vibrated on the echoes, were caught up and answered by new harmony from different quarters. Amidst these bursts of music, which, as if the work of enchantment, seemed now close at hand, now softened by distant space, now wailing so low and sweet as if that distance were gradually prolonged until only the last lingering strains could reach the ear, Queen Elizabeth crossed the Gallery Tower, and came upon the long bridge which extended from thence to Mortimer's Tower, and which was already as light as day, so many torches had been fastened to the palisades on either side. Most of the nobles here alighted, and sent their horses to the neighbouring village of Kenilworth, following the Queen on foot, as did the gentlemen who had stood in array to receive her at the Gallery Tower. On this occasion, as at different times during the evening, Raleigh addressed himself to Tressilian, and was not a little surprised at his vague and unsatisfactory answers, which, joined to his leaving his apartment without any assigned reason, appearing in an undress when it was likely to be offensive to the Queen, and some other symptoms of irregularity which he thought he discovered, led him to doubt whether his friend did not labour under some temporary derangement. Meanwhile the Queen had no sooner stepped on the bridge than a new spectacle was provided, for as soon as the music gave signal that she was so far advanced, a raft so disposed as to resemble a small floating island, illuminated by a great variety of torches, and surrounded by floating pageants formed to represent sea-horses, on which sat Tritons, Nereids, and other famous deities of the seas and rivers, made its appearance upon the lake, and issuing from behind a small heronry, where it had been concealed, floated gently toward the farther end of the bridge. On the islet appeared a beautiful woman, clad in a watchet-coloured silken mantle, bound with a broad girdle, inscribed with characters like the phylacteries of the Hebrews. Her feet and arms were bare, but her wrists and ankles were adorned with gold bracelets of uncommon size. Amidst her long, silky black hair she wore a crown or chaplet of artificial mistletoe, and bore in her hand a rod of ebony tipped with silver. 2 nymphs attended on her, dressed in the same antique and mystical guise. The pageant was so well managed that this lady of the floating island, having performed her voyage with much picturesque effect, landed at Mortimer's Tower, with her 2 attendants, just as Elizabeth presented herself before that outwork. The stranger then, in a well-penned speech, announced herself as that famous Lady of the Lake, renowned in the stories of King Arthur, who had nursed the youth of the redoubted Sir Launcelot, and whose beauty had proved too powerful both for the wisdom and the spells of the mighty Merlin. Since that early period she had remained possessed of her crystal dominions, she said, despite the various men of fame and might by whom Kenilworth had been successively tenanted. The Saxons, the Danes, the Normans, the St. Loes, the Clintons, the Montforts, the Mortimers, the Plantagenets, great though they were in arms and magnificence, had never, she said, caused her to raise her head from the waters which hid her crystal palace. But a greater than all these great names had now appeared, and she came in homage and duty to welcome the peerless Elizabeth to all sport which the castle and its environs, which lake or land could afford. The Queen received this address also with great courtesy, and made answer in raillery. "We thought this lake had belonged to our own dominions, fair dame, but since so famed a lady claims it for hers, we will be glad at some other time to have further communing with you touching our joint interests." With this gracious answer the Lady of the Lake vanished, and Arion, who was amongst the maritime deities, appeared upon his dolphin. But Lamborn, who had taken upon him the part in the absence of Wayland, being chilled with remaining immersed in an element to which he was not friendly, having never got his speech by heart, and not having, like the porter, the advantage of a prompter, paid it off with impudence, tearing off his vizard and swearing, "Cog's bones!" He was none of Arion or Orion either, but honest Mike Lamborn, that had been drinking Her Majesty's health from morning till midnight, and was come to bid her heartily welcome to Kenilworth Castle. This unpremeditated buffoonery answered the purpose probably better than the set speech would have done. The Queen laughed heartily, and swore in her turn that he had made the best speech she had heard that day. Lamborn, who instantly saw his jest had saved his bones, jumped ashore, gave his dolphin a kick, and declared he would never meddle with fish again except at dinner. At the same time that the Queen was about to enter the castle, a memorable discharge of fireworks by water and land took place. Such, says Master Lanham, the clerk of the council chamber door, was the blaze of burning darts, the gleams of stars coruscant, the streams and hail of fiery sparks, lightnings of wildfire, and flight shot of thunderbolts, with continuance, terror, and vehemency, that the heavens thundered, the waters surged, and the earth shook, and for my part, hardy as I am, it made me very vengeably afraid. End of section 77. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
Section 78 of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The World's Story, Volume 9, England. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 78. The Armada, 1588, by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Attend all ye who list to hear our noble England's praise. I tell you of thrice famous deeds she wrought in ancient days, when that great fleet invincible against her bore in vain the richest spoils of Mexico, the stoutest hearts of Spain. It was about the lovely close of a warm summer day, there came a gallant merchant ship full sail to Plymouth Bay. Her crew had seen Castile's black fleet beyond Arenes Isle, At earliest twilight on the waves lie heaving many a mile. At sunrise she escaped their van by God's especial grace, and the tall Pinta till the noon had held her close in chase. Forthwith a guard on every gun was placed along the wall. The beacon blazed upon the roof of Edgecombe's lofty hall. Many a light fishing bark put out to pry along the coast, and with loose rein and bloody spur rode inland many a post. With his white hair unbonneted the stout old sheriff comes. Behind him march the halberdiers, before him sound the drums. His yeomen round the market cross make clear an ample space, for there behooves him to set up the standard of her grace. And haughtily the trumpets peal, and gaily dance the bells, as slow upon the labouring wind the royal blazon swells. Look how the lion of the sea lifts up his ancient crown, and underneath his deadly paw treads the gay lilies down. So stalked he when he turned to flight on that famed Picard field, Bohemia's plume and Genoa's bow and Caesar's eagle shield. So glared he when at Agincourt in wrath he turned to bay, and crushed and torn beneath his claws the princely hunters lay. Ho, strike the flagstaff deep, Sir Knight, ho, scatter flowers, fair maids, ho, gunners, fire a loud salute, ho, gallants, draw your blades. Thou sun, shine on her joyously, ye breezes, waft her wide, our glorious Semper Eadem, the banner of our pride. The freshening breeze of eve unfurled that banner's massy fold, the parting gleam of sunshine kissed that haughty scroll of gold. Night sank upon the dusky beach and on the purple sea. Such night in England ne'er had been, nor ne'er again should be. From Eddystone to Berwick bounds, from Lynn to Milford Bay, that time of slumber was as bright and busy as the day. For swift to east and swift to west the ghastly war flame spread. High on St. Michael's Mount it shone on Beachy Head. Far on the deep the Spaniards saw along each southern shire, cape beyond cape in endless range, those twinkling points of fire. The fisher left his skiff to rock on Tamar's glittering waves, the rugged miners poured to war from Mendip's sunless caves. O'er Longleat's towers, o'er Cranbourne's oaks, the fiery herald flew. He roused the shepherds of Stonehenge, the rangers of Beaulieu. Right sharp and quick the bells all night rang out from Bristol town, and ere the day 300 horse had met on Clifton Down. The sentinel on Whitehall gate looked forth into the night, and saw o'erhanging Richmond's hill the streak of blood-red light. Then bugles note and cannons roar, the death-like silence broke, and with one start and with one cry the royal city woke. At once on all her stately gates arose the answering fires, at once the wild alarum clashed from all her reeling spires. From all the batteries of the tower pealed loud the voice of fear, and all the 1,000 masts of Thames sent back a loudest cheer. And from the farthest wards was heard the rush of hurrying feet, and the broad streams of pikes and flags rushed down each roaring street. And broader still became the blaze, and louder still the din, as fast from every village round the horse came spurring in. And eastward straight from wild Blackheath the warlike errand went, and roused in many an ancient hall the gallant squires of Kent. Southward from Surrey's pleasant hills flew those bright couriers forth, high on bleak Hampstead's swarthy moor they started for the north, and on without a pause, untired they bounded still. All night from tower to tower they sprang from hill to hill. till the proud P unfurled the flag o'er Darwin's rocky dales, till like volcanoes flared to heaven the stormy hills of Wales, till 12 fair counties saw the blaze on Malvern's lonely height, till streamed in crimson on the wind the Wrekin's crest of light, till broad and fierce the star came forth on Ely's stately fane, and tower and hamlet rose in arms o'er all the boundless plain, till Beaver's lordly terraces the sign to Lincoln sent, and Lincoln sped the message on o'er the wide vale of Trent, till Skiddle saw the fire that burned on Gaunt's embattled pile, and the red glare on Skiddle roused the burghers of Carlisle. End of section 78. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Alan Mapstone in Oxford, England.
Section 79 of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The World Story, Volume 9, England, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 79, The Fight with the Invincible Armada, 1588, by David Hume. The Queen had foreseen the invasion, and finding that she must now contend for her crown with the whole force of Spain, she made preparations for resistance. Nor was she dismayed with that power by which all Europe apprehended she must of necessity be overwhelmed. Her force indeed seemed very unequal to resist so potent an enemy. All the sailors in England amounted at that time to about 14,000 men. The size of the English shipping was in general so small that except a few of the Queen's ships of war, there were not 4 vessels belonging to the merchants which exceeded 400 tons. The Royal Navy consisted of only 28 sail, many of which were of small size. None of them exceeded the bulk of our largest frigates, and most of them deserved rather the name of pinnaces than ships. The only advantage of the English fleet consisted in the dexterity and courage of the seamen, who, being accustomed to sail in tempestuous seas and expose themselves to all dangers, as much exceeded in this particular the Spanish mariners, as their vessels were inferior in size and force to those of that nation. All the commercial towns of England were required to furnish ships for reinforcing this small navy, and they discovered on the present occasion great alacrity in defending their liberty and religion against those imminent perils with which they were menaced. The citizens of London, in order to show their zeal in the common cause, instead of 15 vessels which they were commanded to equip, voluntarily fitted out double the number. The gentry and nobility hired and armed and manned 43 ships at their own charge, and all the loans of money which the Queen demanded were frankly granted by the persons applied to. Lord Howard of Effingham, a man of courage and capacity, was admiral, and took on him the command of the navy. Drake, Hawkins, and Frobisher, the most renowned seamen in Europe, served under him. The principal fleet was stationed at Plymouth. A smaller squadron, consisting of 40 vessels, English and Flemish, was commanded by Lord Seymour, second son of Protector Somerset, and lay off Dunkirk in order to intercept the Duke of Parma. The land forces of England, compared to those of Spain, possessed contrary qualities to its naval power. They were more numerous than the enemy, but much inferior in discipline, reputation, and experience. An army of 20,000 men was disposed in different bodies along the south coast, and orders were given them, if they could not prevent the landing of the Spaniards, to retire backwards, to waste the country around, and to wait for reinforcements from the neighboring counties before they approached the enemy. A body of 22,000 foot and 1,000 horse, under the command of the Earl of Leicester, was stationed at Tilbury in order to defend the capital. The principal army consisted of 34,000 foot and 2,000 horse, and was commanded by Lord Hunsdon. These forces were reserved for guarding the Queen's person, and were appointed to march whithersoever the enemy should appear. The fate of England, if all the Spanish armies should be able to land, seemed to depend on the issue of a single battle, and men of reflection entertained the most dismal apprehensions when they considered the force of 50,000 veteran Spaniards, commanded by experienced officers under the Duke of Parma, the most consummate general of the age, and compared this formidable armament with the military power which England, not enervated by peace, but long disused to war, could muster up against it. The chief support of the kingdom seemed to consist in the vigor and prudence of the Queen's conduct, who, undismayed by the present dangers, issued all her orders with tranquillity, animated her people to a steady resistance, and employed every resource which either her domestic situation or her foreign alliances could afford her. She sent Sir Robert Sidney into Scotland, and exhorted the king to remain attached to her, and to consider the danger which at present menaced his sovereignty no less than her own from the ambition of the Spanish tyrant. The ambassador found James well disposed to cultivate a union with England, and that prince even kept himself prepared to march with the force of his whole kingdom to the assistance of Elizabeth. Her authority with the King of Denmark, and the tie of their common religion, engaged this monarch, upon her application, to seize a squadron of ships which Philip had bought or hired in the Danish harbors. The Hanse towns, though not at that time on good terms with Elizabeth, were induced by the same motives to retard so long the equipment of some vessels in their ports that they became useless to the purpose of invading England. All the Protestants throughout Europe regarded this enterprise as the critical event which was to decide forever the fate of their religion, and though unable by reason of their distance to join their forces to that of Elizabeth, they kept their eyes fixed on her conduct and fortune, and beheld with anxiety, mixed with admiration, the intrepid countenance with which she encountered that dreadful tempest which was every moment advancing toward her. The Queen also was sensible that, next to the general popularity which she enjoyed, and the confidence which her subjects reposed in her prudent government, the firmest support of her throne consisted in that general zeal of the people for the Protestant religion, and the strong prejudices which they had imbibed against popery. She took care, on the present occasion, to revive in the nation this attachment to their own sect, and their abhorrence of the opposite. The English were reminded of their former dangers from the tyranny of Spain. All the barbarities exercised by Mary against the Protestants were ascribed to the councils of that bigoted and imperious nation. The bloody massacres in the Indies, the unrelenting executions in the Low Countries, the horrid cruelties and iniquities of the Inquisition were set before men's eyes. A list and description were published, and pictures dispersed, of the several instruments of torture with which, it was pretended, the Spanish Armada was loaded, and every artifice as well as reason was employed to animate the people to a vigorous defense of their religion, their laws, and their liberties. But while the Queen, in this critical emergency, roused the animosity of the nation against popery, She treated the partisans of that sect with moderation, and gave not way to an undistinguishing fury against them. Though she knew that Sixtus V, the present pope, famous for his capacity and his tyranny, had fulminated a new bull of excommunication against her, had deposed her, had absolved her subjects from their oaths of allegiance, had published a crusade against England, and had granted plenary indulgences to everyone engaged in the present invasion, she would not believe that all her Catholic subjects could be so blinded as to sacrifice to bigotry their duty to their sovereign and the liberty and independence of their native country. She rejected all violent counsels by which she was urged to seek pretenses for dispatching the leaders of that party. She would not even confine any considerable number of them, and the Catholics, sensible of this good usage, generally expressed great zeal for the public service. Some gentlemen of that sect, conscious that they could not justly expect any trust or authority, entered themselves as volunteers in the fleet or army. Some equipped ships at their own charge and gave the command of them to Protestants. Others were active in animating their tenants and vassals and neighbors to the defense of their country, and every rank of men, bearing for the present all party distinctions, seemed to prepare themselves with order as well as vigor to resist the violence of these invaders. The more to excite the martial spirit of the nation, the Queen appeared on horseback in the camp at Tilbury, and riding through the lines, discovered a cheerful and animated countenance, exhorted the soldiers to remember their duty to their country and their religion, and professed her intention, though a woman, to lead them herself into the field against the enemy, and rather to perish in battle than survive the ruin and slavery of her people. By this spirited behavior she revived the tenderness and admiration of the soldiery, and attachment to her person became a kind of enthusiasm among them, and they asked one another whether it were possible that Englishmen could abandon this glorious cause, could display less fortitude than appeared in the female sex, or could ever by any dangers be induced to relinquish the defense of their heroic princess. The Spanish Armada was ready in the beginning of May, but the moment it was preparing to sail, the Marquis of Santa Croce, the admiral, was seized with a fever of which he soon after died. The vice admiral, the Duke of Paliano, by a strange concurrence of accidents, at the very same time suffered the same fate, and the king appointed for admiral the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a nobleman of great family, but unexperienced in action and entirely unacquainted with sea affairs. Arcareta was appointed vice admiral. This misfortune, besides the loss of so great an officer of Santa Croce, retarded the sailing of the Armada and gave the English more time for their preparations to oppose them. At last the Spanish fleet, full of hopes and alacrity, set sail from Lisbon, but next day met with a violent tempest, which scattered the ships, sunk some of the smallest, and forced the rest to take shelter in the Groyne, where they waited till they could be refitted. When news of this event was carried to England, the Queen concluded that the design of an invasion was disappointed for the summer, and being always ready to lay hold on every pretense for saving money, she made Walsingham write to the admiral, directing him to lay up some of the larger ships and to discharge the seamen. But Lord Effingham, who was not so sanguine in his hopes, used the freedom to disobey these orders, and he begged leave to retain all the ships in service, though it should be at his own expense. He took advantage of a north wind and sailed toward the coast of Spain with an intention of attacking the enemy in their harbors. But the wind changing to the south, he became apprehensive lest they might have set sail, and by passing him at sea invade England, now exposed by the absence of the fleet. He returned therefore with the utmost expedition to Plymouth, and lay at anchor in that harbor. Meanwhile all the damages of the Armada were repaired, and the Spaniards with fresh hopes set out again to sea in prosecution of their enterprise. The fleet consisted of 130 vessels, of which near 100 were galleons, and were of greater size than any ever before used in Europe. It carried on board 19,295 soldiers, 8,456 mariners, 2,088 galley slaves, and 2,630 great pieces of brass ordnance. It was victualled for 6 months, and was attended by 20 lesser ships called caravels, and 10 salves with 6 oars apiece. The plan formed by the King of Spain was that the Armada should sail to the coast opposite to Dunkirk and Newport, and having chased away all English or Flemish vessels which might obstruct the passage, for it was never supposed they could make opposition, should join themselves with the Duke of Parma, should thence make sail to the Thames, and having landed the whole Spanish army, thus complete at one blow the entire conquest of England. In prosecution of this scheme, Philip gave orders to the Duke of Medina that in passing along the Channel he should sail as near the coast of France as he could with safety, that he should by this policy avoid meeting with the English fleet, and keeping in view the main enterprise, should neglect all smaller successes which might prove an obstacle or even interpose a delay to the acquisition of a kingdom. After the Armada was under sail, they took a fisherman, who informed them that the English admiral had been lately at sea, had heard of the tempest which scattered the Armada, and retired back into Plymouth, and no longer expecting an invasion this season, had laid up his ships, and discharged most of the seamen. From this false intelligence the Duke of Medina conceived the great facility of attacking and destroying the English ships in harbor, and he was tempted by the prospect of so decisive an advantage to break his orders and make sail directly for Plymouth, a resolution which proved the safety of England. The Lizard was the first land made by the Armada about sunset, and as the Spaniards took it for the Ram Head near Plymouth, they bore out to sea with an intention of returning next day and attacking the English navy. They were descried by Fleming, a Scottish pirate who was roving in those seas, and who immediately set sail to inform the English admiral of their approach, another fortunate event which contributed extremely to the safety of the fleet. Effingham had just time to get out of port when he saw the Spanish Armada coming full sail toward him, disposed in the form of a crescent and stretching the distance of 7 miles from the extremity of one division to that of the other. The writers of that age raised their style by a pompous description of the spectacle, the most magnificent that had ever appeared upon the ocean, infusing equal terror and admiration into the minds of all beholders. The lofty masts, the swelling sails, and the towering prows of the Spanish galleons seem impossible to be justly painted but by assuming the colors of poetry, and an eloquent historian of Italy, in imitation of Camden, has asserted that the Armada, though the ships bore every sail, yet advanced with a slow motion, as if the ocean groaned with supporting, and the winds were tired with impelling so enormous a weight. The truth, however, is that the largest of the Spanish vessels would scarcely pass for third rates in the present navy of England. Footnote: this was written in 1776. End of footnote. Yet were they so ill-framed or so ill-governed that they were quite unwieldy, and could not sail upon a wind, nor tack on occasion, nor be managed in stormy weather by the seamen. Neither the mechanics of shipbuilding nor the experience of mariners had attained so great perfection as could serve for the security of government of such bulky vessels, and the English, who had already had experience how unserviceable they commonly were, beheld without dismay their tremendous appearance. Effingham gave orders not to come to close fight with the Spaniards, where the size of the ships he suspected and the numbers of the soldiers would be a disadvantage to the English, but to cannonade them at a distance, and to wait the opportunity which winds, currents, or various accidents must afford him of intercepting some scattered vessels of the enemy. Nor was it long before the event answered expectation. A great ship of Biscay, on board of which was a considerable part of the Spanish money, took fire by accident, and while all hands were employed in extinguishing the flames, she fell behind the rest of the armada. The great galleon of Andalusia was detained by the springing of her mast, and both these vessels were taken, after some resistance, by Sir Francis Drake. As the armada advanced up the channel, the English hung upon its rear and still infested it with skirmishes. Each trial abated the confidence of the Spaniards and added courage to the English, and the latter soon found that even in close fight the size of the Spanish ships was no advantage to them. Their bulk exposed them the more to the fire of the enemy, while their cannon, placed too high, shot over the heads of the English. The alarm having now reached the coast of England, the nobility and gentry hastened out with their vessels from every harbor and reinforced the admiral. The Earls of Oxford, Northumberland, and Cumberland, Sir Thomas Cecil, Sir Robert Cecil, Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Thomas Vavasour, Sir Thomas Gerard, Sir Charles Blount, with many others, distinguished themselves by this generous and disinterested service of their country. The English fleet, after the conjunction of those ships, amounted to 140 sail. The armada had now reached Calais and cast anchor before that place, in expectation that the Duke of Parma, who had gotten intelligence of their approach, would put to sea and join his forces to them. The English admiral practiced here a successful stratagem upon the Spaniards. He took 8 of his smaller ships, and filling them with all combustible materials, sent them one after another into the midst of the enemy. The Spaniards fancied that they were fire ships of the same contrivance with a famous vessel which had lately done so much execution in the Schelde near Antwerp, and they immediately cut their cables and took to flight with the greatest disorder and precipitation. The English fell upon them next morning while in confusion, and besides doing great damage to other ships, they took or destroyed about 12 of the enemy. By this time it was become apparent that the intention for which these preparations were made by the Spaniards was entirely frustrated. The vessels provided by the Duke of Parma were made for transporting soldiers, not for fighting, and that general, when urged to leave the harbor, positively refused to expose his flourishing army to such apparent hazard, while the English not only were able to keep the sea, but seemed even to triumph over their enemy. The Spanish admiral found in many wrong counters that while he lost so considerable a part of his own navy, he had destroyed only 1 small vessel of the English, and he foresaw that by continuing so unequal a combat he must draw inevitable destruction on all the remainder. He prepared therefore to return homewards, but as the wind was contrary to his passage through the Channel, he resolved to sail northwards, and making the tour of the island, reached the Spanish harbors by the ocean. The English fleet followed him during some time, and had not their ammunition fallen short by the negligence of the officers in supplying them, they had obliged the whole armada to surrender at discretion. The Duke of Medina had once taken that resolution, but was diverted from it by the advice of his confessor. This conclusion of the enterprise would have been more glorious to the English, but the event proved almost equally fatal to the Spaniards. A violent tempest overtook the armada after it passed the Orkneys. The ships had already lost their anchors and were obliged to keep to sea. The mariners, unaccustomed to such hardships and not able to govern such unwieldy vessels, yielded to the fury of the storm and allowed their ships to drive either on the western isles of Scotland or on the coast of Ireland, where they were miserably wrecked. Not a half of the navy returned to Spain, and the seamen, as well as soldiers who remained, were so overcome with hardships and fatigue, and so dispirited by their discomfiture, that they filled all Spain with accounts of the desperate valor of the English and of the tempestuous violence of that ocean which surrounds them. Such was the miserable and dishonorable conclusion of an enterprise which had been preparing for 3 years, which had exhausted the revenue and force of Spain, and which had long filled all Europe with anxiety or expectation. End of Section 79. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 80 of England, read for LibriVox.org by Sonia. The Last Moment of Queen Elizabeth by Paul Delaroche, French artist, 1797 to 1856, painting page 562. Queen Elizabeth signed the death warrant of her favourite, the Earl of Essex, with the greatest reluctance, and after his execution she sank into a profound melancholy. Her strength failed rapidly, and all knew that her death could not be far away. She refused to be carried to her bed, and for 10 days the great queen lay on the floor groaning and sighing. She would not take the medicine which her physicians prescribed, she would not eat, and she rarely spoke. The council were in session, and at length they sent the keeper, admiral, and secretary to learn her will in regard to her successor. "I would have a king to succeed me," she said faintly, and this was, of course, interpreted to indicate the King of Scots. "Fix your thoughts upon God," said the Archbishop of Canterbury gently. "I do," she replied, "nor do they wander from him in the least." She soon closed her eyes in a deep slumber, and from this she did not awake. In the picture the queen is seen lying on the floor. The royal ermine is about her, and she is adorned with jewels, but her face is pinched and haggard with age and with suffering. The 3 men sent by the council have just entered the apartment, and one of them, kneeling beside her, is asking whom she will have to succeed her. End of section 80. This recording is in the public domain. Section 81 of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. The World Story, Volume 9, England. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 81. The Revenge, A Ballad of the Fleet, by Alfred Lord Tennyson. In 1591 an English squadron was on the way to intercept the Spanish vessels with their vast amount of treasure from the New World. A strong Spanish fleet came upon them, but Grenville, who was second in command, delayed till he could get his sick men safely on board. He then tried to sail through the Spanish fleet, but was overpowered, after many hours of desperate fighting. The Editor. 1. At Flores, in the Azores, Sir Richard Grenville lay, and the pinnace, like a fluttered bird, came flying from far away. "Spanish ships of war at sea, we have sighted 53. Then sware Lord Thomas Howard, "For God, I am no coward, but I cannot meet them here, for my ships are out of gear, and the half my men are sick. I must fly, but follow quick. We are 6 ships of the line. Can we fight with 53? 2. Then spake Sir Richard Grenville, "I know you are no coward. You fly them for a moment to fight with them again. But I've 90 men, and more that are lying sick ashore. I should count myself the coward if I left them, my Lord Howard, to these Inquisition dogs and the devildoms of Spain." 3. So Lord Howard passed away with 5 ships of war that day, till he melted like a cloud in the silent summer heaven. But Sir Richard bore in hand all his sick men from the land, very carefully and slow, men of Bideford in Devon, and we laid them on the ballast down below. For we brought them all aboard, and they blessed him in their pain, that they were not left to Spain, to the thumbscrew and the stake, for the glory of the Lord. 4. He had only 100 seamen to work the ship and to fight, and he sailed away from Flores till the Spaniard came in sight, with his huge sea castles heaving upon the weather bow. "Shall we fight, or shall we fly? Good Sir Richard, let us know, for to fight is but to die. There'll be little of us left by the time this sun be set." And Sir Richard said again, "We be all good Englishmen. Let us hang these dogs of Seville, the children of the devil, for I never turned my back upon Don or devil yet." 5. Sir Richard spoke, and he laughed, and we roared a hurrah, and so, the little Revenge ran on sheer into the heart of the foe, with 100 fighters on deck and her 90 sick below, for half of their fleet to the right and half to the left was seen, and the little Revenge ran on through the long sea lane between. 6. Thousands of their soldiers looked down from their decks and laughed. Thousands of their seamen made mock at the mad little craft, running on and on till delayed by their mountain-like San Philip, that of 1,500 tons, and upshadowing high above us with her yawning tiers of guns, took the breath from our sails, and we stayed. 7. And while now the great San Philip hung above us like a cloud, whence the thunderbolt will fall, long and loud, 4 galleons drew away from the Spanish fleet that day, and 2 upon the larboard, and 2 upon the starboard lay, and the battle thunder broke from them all. 8. But anon the great San Philip she bethought herself and went, having that within her womb that had left her ill content, and the rest they came aboard us, and they fought us hand to hand, for 12 times they came with their pikes and musketeers, and 12 times we shook 'em off as a dog that shakes his ears, when he leaps from the water to the land. 9. And the sun went down, and the stars came out far over the summer sea, but never a moment ceased the fight of the 1 and the 53. Ship after ship, the whole night long, their high-built galleons came. Ship after ship, the whole night long, with her battle thunder and flame. Ship after ship, the whole night long, drew back with her dead and her shame, for some were sunk, and many were shattered, and so could fight us no more. God of battles, was ever a battle like this in the world before? 10. For he said, fight on, though his vessel was all but a wreck, and it chanced that when half of the summer night was gone, with a grisly wound to be dressed, he had left the deck. But a bullet struck him that was dressing it suddenly dead, and himself he was wounded again in the side and the head, and he said, fight on, fight on. 11. And the night went down, and the sun smiled out far over the summer sea, and the Spanish fleet with broken sides lay round us all in a ring, but they dared not touch us again, for they feared that we still could sting. So they watched what the end would be, and we had not fought them in vain, but in perilous plight were we, seeing 40 of our poor 100 were slain, and half of the rest of us maimed for life, in the crash of the cannonades and the desperate strife, and the sick men down in the hold were most of them stark and cold, and the pikes were all broken or bent, and the powder was all of it spent. And the masts and rigging were lying over the side, but Sir Richard cried in his English pride, we have fought such a fight for a day and a night as may never be fought again. We have won great glory, my men, and a day less or more, at sea or ashore, we die, does it matter when? Sink me the ship, Master Gunner, sink her, split her in twain, fall into the hands of God, not into the hands of Spain. 12. And the gunner said, aye, aye, but the seamen made reply, we have children, we have wives, and the Lord has spared our lives. We will make the Spaniard promise, if we yield, to let us go, we shall live to fight again, and to strike another blow. And the lion there lay dying, and they yielded to the foe. 13. And the stately Spanish men to their flagship bore him then, where they laid him by the mast, old Sir Richard caught at last, and they praised him to his face with their courtly foreign grace. But he rose upon their decks, and he cried, I have fought for Queen and faith, like a valiant man and true. I have only done my duty, as a man is bound to do. With a joyful spirit I, Sir Richard Grenville, die. And he fell upon their decks, and he died. 14. And they stared at the dead that had been so valiant and true, and had holden the power and glory of Spain so cheap, that he dared her with one little ship and his English few. Was he devil or man? He was devil for aught they knew, but they sank his body with honour down into the deep, and they manned the Revenge with a swarthier alien crew, and away she sailed with her loss and longed for her own. when a wind from the lands they had ruined awoke from sleep, and the water began to heave, and the weather to moan, and or ever that evening ended, a great gale blew, and a wave like the wave that is raised by an earthquake grew, till it smote on their hulls and their sails and their masts and their flags, and the whole sea plunged, and fell on the shot-shattered navy of Spain, and the little Revenge herself went down by the island crags, to be lost evermore in the main. End of section 81. End of